Hello and welcome to our watercolor journey. Today we are going to focus on two techniques, salt and negative painting. The basic drawings of these daisies can be used to create a variety of different paintings. They are actually quite useful if you want to try different backgrounds without having to figure out what kind of foreground to add. These are some examples of what we did with them. All the materials used are listed in the description below. So gear up and come paint with us. The Winsor & Newton paper is taped to a flat board. You can use washi tape or ordinary masking tape. You are going to paint a rather wet background, so make sure the tape is secure to prevent seepage. Heinrich used the Art Secret No. 10 mop to wet the background. This mop holds a lot of water. It also has a very fine point, which makes it easier to wet around the daisies. Because he's doing negative painting, he needs to keep the daisies dry. He uses the mop and later the silver black velvet No. 4 round to carefully wet all the areas between the petals. You can use masking fluid to preserve the white of the paper, but in this case, he's working on the skill of negative painting, where you paint around an object to make it stand out. Here is something to consider. If you live in a climate where the paper dries fast, you might want to use a small brush and wet around the flowers first, then use a larger brush to wet the rest of the paper. The water will seep into the areas where you used the small brush. If you need to, you can go around the flowers again with a small brush. You can also do it the other way around, where you wet the larger areas first and then go into the smaller areas with a small brush. In any event, you'll have to work fast. You will see later on in this demonstration that it can be a bit tricky to try and add backgrounds or shadows once your initial background has dried. On the palette, we have Dioxazine Violet or Winsor Violet by Winsor & Newton. Heinrich uses the silver black velvet No. 12 round to add the violet to the entire background. He uses the tip of the silver to go into the very fine areas between the petals, as the purple light will show through these openings. To create a greater contrast between the white flowers and the background, he adds a bit stronger pigment here. The stronger pigment will also help when he adds the salt later on. He's still using the No. 12 brush, but you can use a smaller brush for the areas between the petals. You can see that some areas on the paper have already begun to dry. It is important that you work fast. He adds a bit of water to help spread the pigment and to keep the paper wet. The left-hand side of the paper has already dried to a dull pastel color, so he didn't add any more paint there. If you add paint here now, it will cause terrible cauliflowers and blooms and runbacks. Although these effects do have their place, they are not what he wanted, so he left it like it is. Now he adds the salt. He starts on the drier side and then drops the salt in lightly on the wetter areas. The sheen is almost off the paint, so this is the ideal time to add the salt. Don't rub it in between your fingers. It will be too fine and won't give a good texture. Just drop it in lightly. If the salt makes little air bubbles, it's working. Let it dry naturally. The paper is dried and he has removed all the salt residue. You can see on the left where the paper was drier with less pigment, the salt made little separate patches. Where the paper was wetter and the pigment was stronger, he got a different result from the salt. On the palette, we now have dioxazine violet, quinacridone gold by Winsor & Newton, perylene green by Winsor & Newton, and a tiny bit of sepia by Schmincke. He also used sap green from his main palette. He uses the silver black velvet number 4 round to wet the center of the flower and then lightly drops in a touch of the quin gold. Then he adds some stronger quin gold to emphasize the bottom part of the center. He does the same with the other 2 flowers. To create the shadows, he dabs in a bit of sepia, still working wet on wet. The sap green by Schmincke is up next. He paints the first layer of the stems with the sap green and he will add perylene green for the shadows. Usually you will blend the hard lines to create a softer look, but this time he wanted to preserve the hard lines as a contrast to the soft feathery background, so he left the paint to dry where he placed it. To highlight the petals a bit more, he uses dioxazine violet to paint the shadows between the petals. This is also a form of negative painting. Here you use the shadows to emphasize the flowers. He wets the paper a bit to blend in the shadow colors. If he had just added the colors, it would give hard lines. Adding water softens the lines and helps the paint to spread more evenly. He's working very lightly to try and preserve the effects of the salt. Of course, this would have been a whole lot easier if he had used masking fluid, but where's the fun in that? Now he uses a very watery mix of the violet to add shadows to the petals. The petals can't simply stay white, they need some definition and texture, so he lightly paints some violet lines into the petals. He decided that he wanted to soften the hard lines a little bit, but it is much harder to do so once the paint is dried. If you want softer lines, it's best to blend them in while the paint is still wet, or you can easily overwork the painting. He used a glass pen and some of the dioxazine violet to sign the painting. There we are, tips about using salt and some guidelines for negative painting. Which do you prefer, using masking fluid or negative painting? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Vaya con Dios.